Good morning, everyone, and I think we are waiting for other members to join the webinar, and we will start in 5 minutes. I don't know how many people have logged yet, but we are still waiting for a higher number of people to join before we can start. Thank you. Fatma, there's one of the attendees that they cannot see the microphone. I don't know if IT can help.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It looks like we've got about 50 participants, Fatma, is that correct?
Yes, we are at 49 right now. And
okay.
I would like just to inform everyone that since this is a webinar, the audio is disabled by default, and all interaction can be through the Q&A or through the chat. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Fatma. And hello and welcome to all the participants. My name is Valerie Dabity. I'm a manager in FIRM, which is Resource Mobilization Partnerships, the division that takes care of the ADF. I'm joined today by Veronica Jardina, who is chief in the division. We'll be speaking to you for about, I think, an hour and a half. We have Fatma on the issue of the ADF. Next week, I think we'll also do a further deep dive into the ADF by talking about the particularities of the resource allocation framework. But we're quite excited to continue the series of the Brown Bag webinars with you. We find that, of course, it's a way to keep you informed of, I think, very topical issues, relevant issues that are happening within the institution. It's a shame we can't see you in person. We used to have these and even have lunch back in the day. That seems like a very far time ago. But in any event, with technology, we're still able to see you, at least your little boxes. And of course, the most important thing is just to share the information with you. And we do hope to be able to get back to office and have a more normal platform soon. So what we'll do is we prepared a presentation for you. I will kick off and Veronica will then complete. We'll of course take questions, I think, through the chat function as well. I'm quite keen to leave space for discussion and questions. Since I think we have perhaps many of you who may not know the ADF completely. So why don't we start off? Sorry, I'm just trying to get my connection. We've had some power cuts of late, and so my things are always being charged. All right, so we talk about the African Development Fund. The African Development Fund, as many of you know, is a concessional fund that provides financing to lower income countries. There are 27 eligible countries, or countries that are eligible for ADF financing, I should say. And in terms of history, I think it's really important to know that the fund has existed for nearly 50 years now, and that it was created after, I guess, the bank was created. Its only purpose, if you will, is to lend to low-income countries. So you've got essentially three financing windows in the institution. You've got the African Development Bank, which funds itself by going on the capital markets and also through reflows. And those are non-concessional, but still, I think, fairly good terms if you're looking at things like Eurobond spreads for countries. You have the African Development Fund, which lends on either concessional terms or provides straight up grants to countries that are not eligible for any other support. Then you have the smaller window, which is Nigeria Trust Fund as well. So with those, that comprises, if you will, the entire African Development Bank group. I wanted also to start off by telling you that we recently won an award from the Center for Global Development, CGD as it's otherwise known, for the quality of the ODA provided by specifically the African Development Fund. IFAD was first and IDA was third. So I think we're quite happy with that. Next slide, please. In terms of how it's set up, I think the particularity of this fund is that you've got primarily non-regional member countries that support the fund, and the fund obviously is exclusively for African lower income countries. We have been wanting to diversify the shareholding, I think, for some time, and we've had some one-off contributions from, I should say, RNCs. It's the case, for example, that Angola and Libya pledged contributions during the ADF 13. Egypt and South Africa are also donors to the fund. But I think that it's really important as we are, I think, at a crossroads, if you will, for ADF, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, that we have to think about how do we diversify the participants into the fund so that we're able to grow, if you will, the fund. The other particularity, if you will, with regards to the ADF has to do with sustainability. And sustainability simply means that the large part of ADF's life has been spent receiving donations in the form of grants from donors. Now, of course, there are reflows, because when you provide loans, even if they're concessional, reflows come back into the pool and are available to lend again. But given the increasing debt situation of many low-income countries, it's become quite urgent, if you will, to find a model which is more sustainable for the ADF. We've gone to the slide dealing with ADF contributors. And here, as I was saying, in terms of the top 5 contributors to ADF through historically, I should say, you've got the US, UK, Japan, Germany, and France, sort of G7 countries that have contributed the largest part to the ADF. And then for ADF 15 specifically, these same countries sort of switch a little bit. You've got sort of the same, if you will, top 5 that are in the league for that. Next slide, please. This is simply to show you in terms of replenishment amounts. We had probably our most successful replenishment for ADF 12 just to monetary amounts, but between ADF 14 and ADF 15, we also had an increase of 28% in a fairly difficult economic environment. So, we should also say that ADF 15 had the highest number of what we call concessional donor loans come through from 4 countries. And so I think it's important to continue to grow the pie, and it's a great visual representation of kind of where we want to go and where we are headed. I should also say, just FYI, that a replenishment cycle is actually 3 years. So you're given a pool of funds to be used over a 3-year cycle. Next, please. Now, it seems that as soon as you finish with a replenishment, and the last discussion for ADF 15, so I believe it happened in December of 2020, ADF 15 was effective in June. December 2019. ADF 15 was effective in June of 2020. And so from that time, you have essentially 3 years, but you're always working towards the next discussion, which is the midterm review, slated to happen in November of this year, and then the replenishment discussion. So you're always in the mode of, what have I committed to do with the pool of funds that I've received? And how do I set myself up for receiving more resources next time around? So of course, within the context of the resources that Africa requires, and perhaps as well in terms of the other players that are on the scene, I think it's important, obviously, to know that we are not the only game in town with respect to resources for Africa. IDA, which is the World Bank's concessional lending arm, is on their 19th replenishment. In total, they have for IDA 19, $82 billion US. Of that amount, I think is actually also quite interesting to understand that the majority of the IDA replenishment does go to African countries. So it's out of 74 countries, 39 of those countries are in fact in Africa. And they receive 65% of the IDA resources. And so what is, I think, important to note is that we are not in the game for providing the greatest amount of resources. I think our value is one of selectivity. And it is something that I think is really quite important. For ADF 15, we were given essentially 2 broad areas in which we should intervene. The first is on sustainable infrastructure that should drive job creation and support private sector. And the second is in the area of capacity building, both institutional and at proper sort of people level, if you will. And so you may want to think about it as both the hard, so infrastructure, as well as the softer side, the capacity building. Now, of course, within these 2 areas, you've got support for private sector, gender, youth, of course, agriculture, all the things that are contained as well within the high fives. But generally speaking, when we're asked to opine on whether or not a particular project, for example, is in keeping with the ADF 15 priorities, those are the 2 buckets, so infrastructure and capacity building, that we look to for this. We should also say as well that in terms of the replenishment process, it is something that requires, of course, the bank's own technical capacity to produce papers on particular subjects, but also about steering a conversation that happens not only when you sit down for the particular meetings, but also throughout the course of the year. So it's the particular events that are attended by the president and members of senior management. Most recently, there was a financing of African Economy Summit that was sponsored by France, which was held on the 18th of May. You also had a number of side events where the bank, using its voice and its platform, we are there to militate in favor of the issues of the day that concern African countries, such as debt and debt management, such as energy, climate change, and the like. And all of this, I think, fits into the discussions regarding the ADF, because again, it's not when you sit down to have the midterm review, or when you sit down for the replenishment process, that you need to think about what type of advocacy that you're having, and certainly how you're telling a story on behalf of countries and making a case for further resources. Next slide, please. So here again, just giving you a bit of a visual representation in terms of the ADF replenishments. I think what's important here is to note the largest ever CDLs that we received for ADF 15. from 4 countries, and the largest, which actually came from Japan. If you recall, Japan being one of our top 5 contributors to ADF. There's also a component of what we call internally generated resources as well, and the bulk of the resources that come then from donor contributions. Next slide, please. Here we're simply to show you the difference between the ADF and the IDA replenishment levels. I mentioned to you this 82 billion for IDA 19. For ADF 15, it was US 7.5 billion. So a bit more than twice as much, if you will. And even, of course, if IDA does cover the whole world and we only cover Africa, I think we did say that 65% of IDA's resources do go to Africa. And so, again, it's important that we are selective in the way that we use our own resources. Next slide, please. Here, the main idea is essentially to understand that the main bulk of resources goes into something called the PBA, a performance-based allocation. So of the 27 ADF eligible countries, those countries receive the bulk of their resources based on their performance, and the performance is graded, if you will, under something called a CPIA, a country performance institutional assessment, which looks at the way in which you manage your budget, your transparency for debt, a whole host of, it's a fairly complicated formula, but I think it's just important to retain the majority of that does go to the PBA. Then there is something called set-asides, and set-asides are monies that don't come into the PBA, but which countries can have access to. And there are 2 major set-asides, one for RO, which is called regional operations, okay? And here, I think it harkens back to even the charter of the institution, that regional integration was one of the goals that was important, if you will, to those who founded the institution. And then something called the TSF, Transition Support Facility. So back in the day, this was called the Fragile States Facility, Post-Conflict Facility, initially set up to help countries that were in conflict and then to deal with arrears clearance. Now it looks at fragility from the lens of a continuum. And so even if you are, for example, a country which doesn't qualify for, let's say, ADF funding, you will still have pockets of fragility. And so we can think of, let's say, a big MIC that has issues with security or with terrorism, or even a small island country, which could be a MIC, but however, is very vulnerable to climate change. And so TSF has, in terms of eligible countries, I believe that there are 17 countries that are eligible for TSF resources. And under the TSF as well, you've got actually 3 discrete windows. And we're actually quite proud that Pillar 2, which focuses on arrears clearance, was able to, this year and late last year, move 2 countries out of arrears that between them had about 60 years in arrears. Those are the countries of Somalia and most recently of Sudan. And so now you only have 1 country, which is in arrears to the bank and also to other institutions, and that's Zimbabwe. Pillar 1 of the TSF provides what we call a top-up to your regular performance-based allocation. And Pillar 3 of the TSF provides what we call targeted assistance. So things like capacity building and the like go through TSF. Finally, we also have 3 other special set-asides. One being, they're not actual set-asides, they're instruments. PSF is a set-aside, whereas the PRG and the PCD are actually 2 instruments. PRG stands for It's the guarantee provided by ADF. So one is a credit guarantee, a partial credit guarantee, and the other one's another performance guarantee that is given to ADF countries when they require this for a loan. And then finally PSF, which is a set aside. So the PSF, which is the bank's instrument for it provides credit and risk insurance to the ADB to promote ADB's investment in non-sovereign operations in LICs. We'll also see a little bit more about how what funding it's gotten from an initial contribution of 165 million. And the PSF is actually an autonomously run vehicle within the institution for reasons of moral hazard, if you will. So with that, we're on, I believe, our 10th slide. I'm going to hand over the floor to Veronica to continue on the discussion of the PBA framework. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Valerie. So we have looked at a bit of the history of the ADF, the different envelopes and instruments. And looking at the PBA, as we said, is the most important component of the fund. The performance is still valued as most of the resources should go to performing countries. How we calculate the performance-based allocation is based on, of course, the amount of resources that are mobilized from donors. There is a formula that has been applied. Part of these resources are put aside for this set aside, like the RO and the TSF, but then the bulk of the resources goes to performance. The performance is calculated based on something called the Country Performance and Institutional Assessment, or the CPIA, which is traditionally done every 2 years and is looking at macroeconomic data of a country, how they are doing in terms of reforms, and looking at gender, cross-cutting issues, environment, and other different aspects. It's led by the chief economist complex and different economists on the ground with the help of the technical staff. And then we are looking also at the performance of the portfolio. So looking at the track record of each country in implementing projects that were allocated through the ADF. But there's also a needs component, because of course we will have to look at the population size of each country and what is the GNI per capita of a country. And in recent years, it was also added another index, which is a composite index, which is bank-owned. It's called the African Infrastructure Development Index. It was looking at different aspects, and being infrastructure one of the main principles and the main goals of the ADF and the bank, this is a very important indicator to see how countries are doing in terms of infrastructure. If you go to the next slide, there are different countries' eligibility. The bulk of the resources are on a grant basis. However, due to their creditworthiness, some of the countries are able to absorb loans. These are highly concessional loans. These are given from the replenishment, but of course, since the ADF introduced new instruments like the concessional donor loans, part of these concessional donor loans are given to countries that are able to absorb loans. How we categorize these countries, the categorization normally is done based on international standards in an agreement with with the World Bank, IMF, and is led by the Strategy and Policy Department. We are looking at the per capita income of the country for the last 2 consecutive years, in order to be able to see that there's not many fluctuations happen. So there are what are traditionally called by other partners the low-income countries, which are, for our case, ADF only, which only can receive grants, only ADF resources. Then you will have other countries that are on a trajectory of graduating eventually into the ADB, and they have different stages. So you will have GAP countries which have creditworthiness, which is above the cutoff of the annual per capita income, but can have resources from ADF on blend terms, so loans and grants. Then you will have blend countries which are below the cutoff. So these are more similar to the ADF type of countries, but they have resources on blend terms. And then finally, we are countries that are in a trajectory to graduate. So they will have a period of time where they're still eligible for ADF resources on blend terms, but they are phasing out, hopefully, out of the ADF and transitioning to the ADB, so they will be able to access resources from both windows. In this other slide, you will see the current classification as of 2021. I suppose you will receive a copy of the presentation, so I don't think I'll go through the whole list of countries because it's going to be not very interesting to list it here in live. So if you go then to the next slide, we said that the bank has what is called the transition state facility. Actually, many of the ADF countries, actually 20 out of 37, are eligible to the transition state facility. This facility has been introduced under different terminologies, as Valerie said, since 2015. Was able to take care of countries that do not have a high performance, so will not receive enough resources based on the PBA, but have high needs and need to be helped by the resources of the fund and the bank to be able to lift the conditions and graduate eventually to a higher stage. So in somehow when we do the PBA formula, we have the PBA allocation based on performance, but then there is a pillar one of of the TSF who allows to have additional resources. This calculation is done on a yearly basis. The bank decides which countries are part of the transition state. It's in alignment with the harmonized list of fragile countries with the World Bank. However, there are slight differences on how we categorize transition states compared to the World Bank. And one of the main scores that is looked at is the CPIA score. So these are countries that have a score of CPA less of 3.2, so they are not doing very well in ways of managing their own resources. They have peacekeeping operations ongoing. They have difficulties they are part of regional fragile countries, or like G5 Sahel, the Horn of Africa. They have spillover effects and potential issues with neighboring countries too. So this is the list of the countries. The most recent success of the TSF. The TSF, as we said, is formed of three pillars. One is the pillar one, the one I've been talking of. Not a very nice name. Its tradition has been given is the top up of the PBA, in the sense that they receive more resources than they should receive out of the PBA. The second pillar is the pillar that is looking at arrears clearance, where donors put aside money for countries that will be able to clear their arrears. So this money has normally is sitting in pillar 2 until there is a worldwide agreement that these countries can be um, are in the path of graduating and having arrears cleared. Most recently, Somalia and Sudan received these resources. Another potential country, but the international community is still looking at the situation, would eventually be down the line Zimbabwe. But these efforts are done in collaboration with the donor community, with the IMF and the World Bank, and actually these arrears were cleared together and even on the same day between the different MDBs. If you can look at the other slide. So as we said, the objective of the TSF was to provide additional funding to be more flexible and assisting regional member countries in becoming more resilient to fragility. Initially, the TSF was only looking at fragility with a narrow definition of fragility, but now the idea is that there can be pockets of fragility even in countries that are not traditionally considered fragile. So the idea is to help them in having a more equal distribution of resources and helping the country coming out of fragility. And we are currently having discussions with deputies on the TSF, its structure, how it would look like in the future. I just maybe just to complement on the initial description. Out of we have pillar 1, the supplemental support window, the pillar 2 for arrears clearance, but also we have a pillar 3 that is looking at helping countries that with technical assistance activities. Is based on a call for proposal that is done annually by the RDTS, the department in charge of fragile countries, and is looking at target support. I think this year is looking at how to help fragile countries work more on private sector and on the governance and results-based funding. So every year the bank decides how to allocate this pillar 3 target support. Of course, the TSF is not the only vehicle that is looking at fragility. There are many other elements in the bank group. The regional operations envelope, we will see later, has been also modified and targeted to looking at issues of fragility on a regional basis. Country strategies papers would have also to look at fragility, and there has to be elements of country dialogue that have been undertaken by the bank also to see and help countries. We can go to the next slide. So another set aside is the regional operations envelope. This envelope is mainly looking at supporting regional efforts. The envelope has increased in ADF 15. It's a set aside, so you can see from the slide that we went from a set aside of 17% to 25% in ADF 15. Is a vehicle that helps building projects that are looking at multiple countries together. There are some it's in accordance with the bank's role and strategy and the orientation of the High Five agenda. And they are looking also at helping countries in doing regional projects, but also has what it is called the regional public goods programs. Many programs were funded through this window, and also help the bank in responding to a regional crisis, like for example, the Ebola crisis when it happened, which was looking at a regional exposure. The regional operations envelope is based on a prioritization that is done every year with the board, of course, agreed with senior management, and then goes to the board. And there's a list of projects that is being prioritized by the RDRI department and then funded through the ADF financing. Next slide, please. As we said, from these traditional envelopes, which were the PBA, the TSF, DRO, within the years, I think it was around ADF 12 and 13, the bank introduced new instruments like the guarantee instrument. So there we have the partial risk guarantee and the partial credit guarantee. The partial risk guarantee is looking at guarantees for sovereign default. So it's helping projects and the bank uses this to help projects come to bankability and able to cover for the default and the failures that the government may have. And it's partially supported by ADF. Of course, there has to be some contributions also from the counterpart, but 21% of the PV allocation can go and be deducted from each guarantee. And then there's the PCG, who would look at countries that are low, moderate risk of debt distress, and they will cover commercial and political risks. We have also introduced the private sector enhancement facility. The main goal was to be able to expand private sector investments in ADF countries. And while the main window is the ADB to do this kind of investments, there is high risk associated investment in low-income countries and fragile countries. Therefore, this is somehow like an insurance mechanism that has been put in place and is backing some of the investments in countries that would be too risky. And it provides a guarantee for low-income countries and covers up to the 50% of the risk exposure of the bank. So the ADF per se does not do investment in private sector and NSO, but this is a way to help otherwise will not have sufficient amount of investments for private sector. Innovation forward, I think we have looked at it somehow. We have ongoing discussions with the deputies. Valerie said we have a traditional cycle of replenishing the resources for different, at least 3 main conversations with donors. And once we agree on the use of the resources, we start that cycle. So at the moment, we have conversations with deputies we introduced in the ADF 16. And the 2 works decided for this ADF 16 working group are mainly fragility and governance. We have also looked at many work streams, and one of the successes of the working group was to agree, for example, to introduce a bridge loan, which was a help and is where the outcomes of the discussions of the working groups. This year we are looking at fragility, so a holistic review of what the TSF is doing, in specifically at the different approaches that have been looking at how to introduce vulnerability indicators be a formula or in the case of formula to be able to give more resources to certain countries that are more in need. These are very technical discussions. We had already 3 working group meetings. So the 4th will be in September. After this working group, the lead is taken by deputies, and they will report to the broader group of deputies, and one discussion of the ADF 16. Another issue is about governance. We said at the beginning, the ADB and ADF were recently established as 2 separate legal vehicles. So there have been other institutions like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and more lately the IFAD that is looking at either merging the 2 concessional and non-concessional windows, or looking at other options to access the market. When it comes to governance, there is the governance for regional member countries is currently capped in the ADF to 1% of shares, and most of the regional member countries are represented by the ADB. And the other 50% is for non-regional member countries. So we are looking at ways to give more voice to regional member countries, ways for them to eventually invest more in the fund. But there are different scenarios that we've been looking at, and of course the issues of shares and shareholding and voting powers. And as we said at the beginning, at the moment we have a limited number of regional member countries that is actually investing in the fund, partially also because they don't have a sufficient voice on their own, but they can speak only on behalf of the African Development Bank when decisions are taken. We are also looking at expanding the PSF. The PSF is the Private Sector Enhancement Facility, which was lately expanded to work more on fragile countries, but possibly we will open it up, the capital, to other investors. There have been discussions with bilateral donors to contribute to the PSF, to look at re-guarantees and looking at a new governance framework. As we said, the PSF is an autonomous vehicle and has to take decisions that are de-linked from the decisions of the bank management to be able to guarantee with the most transparent manner the projects they are taking on board. In the ADF, there is also a contribution from project preparation. As we know, it's often difficult for regional member countries to prepare projects to be part of the pipeline of the ADF. There has been a set aside on PPF in the past, which has been increased in the ADF 15. Probably the resources are not sufficient to cover for all projects preparation we'd like to see, but there is now 75 million that is set aside for countries to be able to prepare projects to be then funded by the fund. Looking forward, also the next appointment that the firm and of course the whole bank complexes have is the midterm review of the ADF. This one is planned for early November 2021. A midterm review normally is a stock-taking exercise where we will tell deputies what we have done with the resources that were given to the fund, how we have used them, what were the success stories, and how we are implementing those that are considered policy commitments. I'm sure you heard this word. We have policy commitments for the GCI, for the capital increase, but also policy commitments for the African Development Fund. Since last replenishment was somehow At the same time of the capital increase, there are certain commitments that are in common, but others that are only peculiar to the ADF, and these are being tracked, and some of the contributions of donors, especially, for example, for the UK, are linked to the fact to whether we are successful or not in committing to delivering on our commitments. So all complexes have different type of commitments, and it's important that they keep track on what is being done. And another issue is about reporting on results, how we communicate, and how we show that the bank and the fund has been successful, and how the dialogue between the two windows happen. This year, because of COVID, it is planned to be done virtually. So hopefully, while there was some in the past difficulty in having many bank staff attending the meetings, there will be more room for even regions to participate. We will hold meetings with the DGs and DDGs, and hopefully having higher voice from regional member countries and regions and different complexes that could intervene eventually, even if it's on a video base. And we have a common platform where all the documents of ADF are posted, and I think we will communicate further where you can see all the documentation and the discussions that have been held now. So over to you, Valerie.
Thanks very much for that, Veronica. So I do hope that's given some of you a flavor for what the ADF is, what it finances, what are the terms on which it makes decisions about allocations, the set-asides, the importance, of course, of communication. So I think now we're going to open up the floor to comments and questions. Lots of you have asked whether or not you'll be able to get the presentation. The answer is yes. We'll handle that for you afterwards. But I think Fatma said that we are handling questions on the chat function. So let me see what is on chat. I've got 4 items. Okay, presentation, slides, shared. So those are easy ones. Yes, the presentation will be shared. Somebody had an issue with the microphone. Hopefully you've got of the presentation, really anything related to the ADF.
Yeah, maybe Valerie, I can take the answer on selectivity and the difference between ADF 15 and 14.
Sure.
So as we said, the ADF is part of the bank and the 10-year strategy and the high five. So all what we do is strictly aligned to what the bank is doing. So the ADF 15 was anchored to the bank strategy and the high fives. However, we were asked to be more selective and focused. It is not only the case for the fund, but also, I don't know if you have seen documentations that went to the board. Also for the GCI, there was a request for the bank to be highly selective. The pillars that were retained for the ADF 15, as Valerie mentioned earlier, maybe just to repeat, it's quality and sustainable infrastructure. So infrastructure being one of the major interests of the fund and the intervention of the bank in the continent, but also how to promote regional integration. And the second pillar, which before used to be a cross-cutting issue, but to voice the importance for that is for deputies is around governance. So governance is a fully fledged pillar, is no longer a cross-cutting issue that it used to be in the past. And helping human and institutional resources to deliver and creating jobs. So these are the main themes. Of course, under infrastructure, there are the energy component, the water and sanitation, all the different components that look at infrastructure. But one of the main interests of donors for the ADF is fragility. So fragility being, as we said, since 20 countries are fragile in Africa, it's a very important issue for the fund. Cross-cutting issues like climate change and gender are of great value for the fund. So they are not huge changes from the different pillars that we had in ADF 14. It's only more focused and selective. There will be a new conversation around ADF 16. The pillars may change, or some will remain the same, but this is an ongoing conversations with deputies. And of course, we are also waiting to see the new TYS, the new strategy, however it will be called, and the ADF will align itself to this strategy of the bank.
Great. Somebody has a question. Thank you, Veronica. Somebody has a question on project preparation, which I think is always a question that has lots and lots of interest, particularly for ADF countries and particularly for fragile states. So I think it's really important to highlight that for ADF 15, the ADF's own project preparation facility called PPF received a set aside for 75 million UA. I think it's the first time that it received a set aside for at least 5 or 6 cycles, and that it's been revamped. Revamped in the sense that it now has a mandate to support private investment, so not provide fuel project preparation to private sector companies, but to support private investment through PPPs. It can also run the gamut from studies all the way up through, if you will, other types of pre-investment activities. And I know that they've been very active. So the facilities run through Firm 1. They have actually their own mailbox. And I know that I've seen lots of exchanges between O'Neill Rane, who runs this, and other staff of the bank on proposals that have been made. What I can tell you is that we need to, or you need to help us, essentially. And the way that you can help us is to use appropriately the resources that we've been provided. And that makes the case for us to then go on and ask for more resources on your behalf. Realizing, of course, that utilization and the like takes time. It's really important to build a pipeline. It's super important to pay attention to quality and to details. And then finally, to always have in mind that if you were to say to someone, I call this the elevator pitch, right? You have 3 minutes with a decision maker in an elevator, and you need to tell them essentially why you should get hired for a job, why they should provide more money to ADF. Distill that down and say, okay, these are the reasons. And I think one of the things which is really important, beyond the papers and the documents that we always look at, produce, is really to go down to the level of who's the beneficiary. And so for ADF 15, when I was looking over the deputy's report that was drafted for this, some of the figures that were provided, for example, the ADF has improved access to electricity for 10.9 million people. We provided agricultural infrastructure and inputs for 90 million people, including 43 million women. Improved access to education for 44.1 million people. So those are the kinds of numbers, of course, that are important because it comes from a results measurement framework that the bank has. But ultimately, if you're talking about millions of people as beneficiaries, I think it really does come down to you finding the one little girl who's gone to school, the one mother who's been able to purchase a hairstyling salon and work for her own business. So those are the kinds of things that are important and really show individual results. And so any of you who are listening who are country managers, who work in country offices, we really do count on you to get these stories for us so that we can amplify them and really show those types of results. So I think at the end of the day, development is not really about the papers we produce, it's about the lives that we change, and these beneficiaries need to speak, they need to talk as well. Thanks.
Yeah, Valerie, so if I may, I can also take the question on green growth. And green growth is very important for the fund. So transitioning to low carbon and climate resilient development was one of the goals of the fund. And we have specific commitments around climate change and green growth. These are commitments that are to be delivered by the ADF and the ADB at the same time. And the bank itself has its own climate finance commitments vis-a-vis the international community. So these are part of the different commitments that also the ADF is looking at. To be able to also to come with commitments and goals on how we can support countries. The most important tool and information we need to receive is about the ADF pipeline, because we are able to request for resources based on real needs and real projects being developed on the ground. So I can see a question from Amin, who's looking at whether we could intervene for a faster ADF 16. I cannot have the last word on this, it's a senior management decision. However, while we have dispersed on time and on track the CRF, which was the COVID response from the ADB and the ADF had a big chunk of resources dedicated to the CRF. We didn't have enough investment projects yet, so we are not really in the same situation as IDA. So for the time being, probably we will not have an advanced ADF 16. Of course, these conversations and decisions will be taken by senior management and during the midterm review. I can see was an anonymous person about the UK bridge loan. As we said, when we cleared arrears for Somalia and Sudan, UK was involved in both countries. UK was the only contributor for the Somalia arrears clearance and provided a bridge loan to the government of Somalia. And by providing this bridge loan, we were able then to re-engage through the Pillar 1 and extend a PBO operation to Somalia to have resources. It was just a liquidity exchange. It only lasted 24 hours technically for the countries to be able to put resources and be able to clear their arrears. In the case of Sudan, we were able to mobilize more donors. Of course, UK was very important in this decision, but we also had interventions from Sweden and I think other countries, but and Ireland. In the case of Somalia, also the European Commission intervened. So, as I said, this was a worldwide effort. There were many donors that were coming in together to help this country to come out of more than 60 years of arrears. So it was an international effort, and we had daily exchanges actually for the Somalia case, because it was the first of the kind where we had interventions directly from donors. But when countries are ready, they show they can do and progress on reforms. I think the international community is happy to come in, and there are international conferences, and they also bilaterally helping them by clearing arrears. I hope I've taken all the questions. I don't know if do you see other questions?
There's a question on, I think, the allocation per country.
Yeah. So the allocations for country, it's mainly done through what we explained before, the performance-based allocation system, just to remain simple. Of course, there are the different set aside and TSF calculations. There is a calculation that is done year by year because we have a 3-year cycle vision. There are no big changes between one year to the other. But of course, the calculations have to be done based on the contributions received to the fund, the liquidity of the fund, how many resources were actually encashed based on the pledges. So when you do your programming, I think you don't have to expect many changes compared to the previous year's allocations. The PBA for 2020 and 2021 are now public. So there will be, you would know the projection for the PBAs for the coming years. So more or less, unless there is an extraordinary replenishment of the ADF, we try to keep allocations within the envelopes as stable as possible. This is why I was saying that in the conversation, looking at reforming the TSF, this is one of our major preoccupations, because by changing radically the PBA and the TSF formula, we may have fluctuations in allocations, and we don't think is a good outcome to discuss with countries big changes in allocations. But this is just internal discussions. Please don't disclose with your partners. Thank you.
So I think, are there any other presentations? Of course, we will share. I think maybe somebody put something in the chat. Let me take a quick look. Differences between such traditional project countries compared to others in the same ADF bracket. So interesting question. Does the performance allocation have a special concession for transitional or federal countries? So because we understand that a performance-based allocation will naturally favor those countries with the strongest performance, but that countries that have sometimes the highest need will not be your best performers. That is the reason why the TSF has been set up and is used, so that funding can go to the most fragile of countries. And that's through, of course, your Pillar 1, as well as your targeted support under Pillar 3. And so there is, if you will, an allowance made or a recognition that it's difficult, if you will, to provide funding to the most fragile countries solely based on a performance allocation. There has to be some element also of needs to it. And so the formula does try to, how should I say, balance this out between needs and performance. Thank you. Let's see what else is left in the Q&A.
I think, well, I can partially answer, but I'm not sure of the question from Goran about whether their current balance is remaining. So normally the normal cycle is that you will have allocations for the first year, the second year, and the third year of the PBA. There may be cases of countries that receive less allocations than they should, or they utilize less than they should have done. For example, Sudan, being under sanctions for some years, received 50% of what they should have received as allocations. So now it will change. So there will be some fluctuations in the allocations we will be doing. But the principle is that when any remaining balance at the third year is being calculated, it's either redistributed on a pro rata basis for each country, but we unlikely have many resources left, and sometimes they are not even sufficient to cover a significant number of projects. Another decision that deputies often take is to roll over these resources to the next cycle. So there will be some of the resources that have been unused, and these are not huge amounts of resources that are rolled into the next replenishment, and they contribute to the envelopes and the calculations of the next replenishment. But I think we will have dedicated sessions, more technical sessions on the PVA, on how much are the allocations for each country. We will have by regions information on what were the allocations, how they were done, and how many resources have been allocated. Although through your VPs or even in DARMs, you can see how much is the allocation for each country. Each country economist should be in a position to know how much has been utilized, and of course, there are some decisions how these resources have been used. There is a cap for the ADF to use on PBOs. Most of this cap has been utilized already because of the COVID response crisis. It's only 25% of the PVA that can be used for PBOs. So there are some conditions on how we use the allocations, but I think more technical sessions will be organized by other colleagues in the course of the year.
All right. Let's see any further. I see two things in the Q&A. Okay, the allocations computed yearly. Is there a possibility periodically sharing data allocations utilized and pending amounts be assessed by countries? Access the data. Sorry, this is the question from Kenneth Onyango, is it? Sorry, I can't see the whole name. About the allocation being computed yearly. And is there a possibility to periodically share data on allocations utilized and pending amounts? So I think actually Veronica just answered the same question.
Yeah, just to say the periodic allocation on yearly basis is agreed with senior management, the president and the board. So this is publicly disclosed. Then each country utilizes resources. Normally, RDVP should be in the know how many resources have been utilized by a given country, by sectors and different type of activities. Of course, firm has a back office function to track that these resources, there's not over allocations, and of course we are consulted by OPSCOM once we will have to see whether the allocations are fine and remaining for that country. Normally, this is the work of the economist, country economists. There are colleagues in that will be able to answer to you. And there's not an online system because we are not country budgeting, so we given country, we try to track it through the IOP and through approvals from to the board, but normally the RDVP you should have a vision how much has been allocated and planned to be allocated to the country.
Okay, let us see if our audience is satisfied. I don't see any further questions.
Yeah, I think there is no more question.
All right.
Yeah, both in chat and Q&A.
And the Q&A, fantastic. So I think this is the point where we say a great big thank you to you for your attention and your time. We hope you found the session to be useful. We will be sharing the presentation afterwards, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any further questions on ADF and the like. I think it's a really exciting time in the history of ADF as we look towards some of the innovations, kind of where we want to go. I think one of the things that I'd forgotten just to share with you is that, I mean, I would consider ADF to be an old fund, right? Created in 1970s. Your newer funds, for example, a vertical fund like a global fund, has or it doesn't have the same limitations, let's say, as an ADF does in its charter. It provides, for example, that everyone who's a member of the global fund must contribute, and according to ability and the like. So it doesn't have to be everybody pays the same thing, but even countries that are beneficiaries, like your Burkina Faso's, your Cote d'Ivoire's, must contribute. It is the same thing, for example, at an EFAD. Also, some of the newer entities do not have a prescription against lending or borrowing on other than non-concessional terms. And so I think as we look towards what in my mind is the evolution of the ADF, I think it's really quite exciting because it's going to hopefully allow us to remain relevant and adapt to our changing clients. Voila. And I think that there are lots of challenges in today's current environment, not the least of which is the whole COVID impact. So with that, we will leave you. Thanks a lot. We'll see you, is it next week or in 2 weeks' time, Fatma, for the next one?
Next week.
Next week, okay.
15. ADF 15.
The resource allocation, okay. So hopefully we'll look at you and see you then. Thanks a lot again for your attention. Everybody, please stay well. And again, thank you. Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time. Bye.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.